record in three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. You know, I love talking to authors because they have the courage to take their thoughts and their stories and maybe the lessons they've learned, put it down in a book and share it with the many, ultimately changing their legacy and destiny in the process. And if you're looking to write a book out there, check out dreamstarterspublishing.com. We can help you out with wherever you're at in the process. And if you have a book you want to generate leads with it, check out bookmarketingcrm.com. Now, as you guys know, I love history. I love true stories. That's what got me into book publishing, book writing. And so the more I understand the past, the more you can prepare for the future, right? They say history might not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So the book that we're talking about today, really don't know much about this world. It's called Capitals, Terrorists, Klansmen, Lawmen, and Employers in the Long 19th Century. So he was, as he was saying before we hit the record button, it really does dissect what happens from the Civil War on to about 1917. So it's an honor to have our guest with us today, Chad Pearson. Thanks so much for being here, man.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, let's start off with the genesis of this book. You have, I think, two other books, but what made you want to sit down and write this book? And if you could give a quick little background on who you are, where you come from, that'd be helpful too.
Certainly. Again, thank you for having me. My name is Chad Pearson. I teach history at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, and have been living in this area for about 12 years, my second year at UNT, and I teach the survey classes as well as business and labor history. And so this is my second book. I've written another one before this, and I edited one before it as well. And it really looks at we look at the late 19th and early 20th century. It's an important period in many ways because this is when the United States became the dominant economic powerhouse, right? It surpassed England, Germany in terms of productivity and whatnot. But it also has, I think, if we're sober about it, sort of a dark side. It was the United States compared to other industrialized countries was also the most repressive. So we have many folks, journalists, lawyers, employers, complaining about what they call the labor problem. Now, this would involve strikes or protests, picketing, sometimes more radical activities like bomb throwing and that kind of thing. And the response was generally fairly repressive. And I look at what that repression looks like by focusing on what I categorize as three different types of repression. And so I look at hard forms, whippings, lynchings, shootings, kidnappings, caging people. I look at what I call soft forms, firing, blacklisting, evicting people from their homes, depriving them of food. And then what I call a hybrid form, which is, say you've got some workers striking, or you have this radical in a particular region. You might have elites in a community who will approach that person and say, you better get out of town. And that could take one of two forms. It could be voluntary or involuntary, and I put that in scare quotes. A voluntary one is, an involuntary one would be, the mob might kidnap the person, put them on a train, put them on a boat, force them out. A voluntary one, and again in scare quotes, would be would involve four steps. So you would intimidate, you would isolate, you would intimidate, you would expel, and then you would blacklist. And both forms tended to work and do what these folks wanted. So just to come back to the central point, American labor business history, very violent. That violence found expression in different ways. And it's one of, not the only, but one of the reasons why the United States became the dominant economic powerhouse globally.
Hmm. Yeah, so I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I obviously hear quite a bit about Carnegie living here.
Sure.
And, because of people like him, they were able to create this incredible, booming business. But also, just when it comes to the industrial age, many people were getting wealthy, ultimately having this separation in classes. There were the
Right.
workers, there were the elite. And that created a major struggle, which then involved the Pinkertons. You've probably heard of these
Oh, of course.
organizations
Yep.
that where the law and order, and I guess this is something that pops up in your book, but what was happening, and maybe this is your book is specifically to the South, but I'm a Billy the Kid fan. I love the Wild West. The incoming of the train and the railroad system all of a sudden changing how America really did business, slaughterhouses popping up. It was a wild time, but what was happening across the board, I guess specifically in the South, what was really boiling to the surface?
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think, both things are absolutely true. So much progress, so much industrial progress. But what I'm trying to look at is, what did that look, how did one we get there, right? And so a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on both sides, frankly. And so I start in the um, I focus on the South and I focus on the West as well, but I focus, nationally. That's the I look at a number of case studies, but you asked about the South, and so coming out of the South, we have the Confederacy's loss in the Civil War, and then the question becomes, well, what happened to these Southern planters, these Confederates, a number of whom joined the first Ku Klux Klan? And I argue, unlike other scholars, that we shouldn't focus on the question of hate. Yes, there are some hateful people, but rather on exploitation, meaning that the most privileged members of society joined the Klan and they forced these former enslaved people back on plantations, back into kitchens because they wanted their labor, right? It was fundamentally about forcing them back. And so some of the techniques that the Klansmen used in the late 1860s were replicated by folks, by vigilantes in the West. So you have the Montana Vigilantes, you have the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, who are really pissed off about these small homesteaders, and they tar them as sort of rustlers. And we see a lot of sort of Wild West sort of activities and whatnot. But these were, often very violent and reflected the class interests of those at the top. So if you look at the South, you look at the West, you look at communities throughout Pennsylvania and much of the Northeast, you're going to see these sort of class struggles. Often they found expression in urban contexts, but they also found expression in rural settings as well.
Hmm. Yeah, so Klansmen came based off of the Confederates losing, and from what I understand, well, obviously you have Lincoln, a Republican,
Mm-hmm.
doing this, and they win. Obviously, the Union wins, or so. Then is it the Democrats that, from what I understand, banded together and then created the Ku Klux Klan? Like you said, it wasn't just the everyday worker; it was many of the elite
That's
Democrats. Is
right.
that right?
That's right. I mean, I don't know if the Democrats, I don't know if it was a real top-down, politically deliberate effort, but certainly the Klan were aligned with the Democratic Party, and of course, the Democratic Party were the party of Jim Crow and racial discrimination, really until in the South until the 1960s, and in the North maybe that changes earlier than that.
Got it. And so the vigilantism, right? I watched. I somewhat study history with Billy the Kid, but there were vigilante gangs all over, right? Vigilante justice, right? They would do hangings, and it was just for, I guess, in the Wild West, right? There was so many pockets that there was no law and order, and
Mm-hmm.
it was probably such an insane time to be alive. But this was happening everywhere, not just in the West, I guess. And I really never realized that maybe it was happening in Pennsylvania. And
Oh,
you're talking about, I guess, more so in Texas than even in Pennsylvania. But
definitely.
vigilante justice. Can you explain that? What was happening
Yeah.
there?
So it's sort of paradoxical, right? Vigilantes were folks who broke the law to uphold the law.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they broke, so they're imposing their own kind of law. And so the way I make sense of them, and I study a number of different groups, including the Klan, law and order leagues, particularly in the Midwest, and these so-called citizens alliances throughout the nation at the in the late 19th, in the early 20th century. And they would often work with official law enforcement, and so they're often complementary rather than doing their own thing. I refer to state judges, politicians, the National Guard, police as sort of enablers. right? They were often on the same side, and I
Wow.
don't
So
want to sound
they were allies
they
technically,
were
right?
allies.
Oh, they're
That's
going to
right.
take care of it. We don't have to. Got it, right?
Right, right, exactly, exactly. If you look at the amount of repression, I mean, you mentioned Carnegie. We can look at Haymarket. We can look at the anarchist uprising in 1886. We can look at the Pullman strike in 1894, or going back even further, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. You have this sort of collaboration between elites in the private sector, sort of working closely with federal, domestic troops, sometimes the National Guard, sometimes even the U.S. Army.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And what spawned all this was what people were just pissed off because of the regulations, the work. I mean, being exploited, right? You have individuals who are being put through some insane living conditions. I mean, when you talk about Carnegie, uh, there were so many people getting hurt. There was no regulations. That's where I realized that, oh, unions in the very beginning, I think were a great thing. I don't think they are to this point because now we're actually being cut out of potentially global powers being able to take our production away. So I look at it in the very beginning, they needed them, but it was because of bad working conditions. People were unhappy. The wage was low. Henry
Mhm.
Ford came in and said, let me fix all this and create a working wage. But it was just because people were unhappy because it was lopsided. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think there's this real sense that you see all the inequality, you experience the exploitation, and the message from the elites was one of say social Darwinism, right? That is, survival of the fittest. But people would look around and they'd say, you know what, I'm working 13 hours a day, I'm exhausted, my pay isn't good enough, I lose a limb here and there, and what is keeping the bosses accountable? Certainly not the state, which aligned with it. And so folks sort of drew conclusions about their workplace conditions and joined with one another. And in dramatic cases, would withdraw their labor power. Sometimes they would join unions and engage in more respectful give and take bargaining. But there was so much resistance to it. And why is there so much resistance? I think the principal reason is ideological, meaning that there's this idea of the open shop, which maybe you know about. I'm sure you know about right to work laws.
Of course.
These are this idea that you frame it as if the union is the problem, not your exploitative boss. Meaning that, right? So you say, hey, look, these unions are preventing workers from their right to work. The language right to work emerged in the late 19th century. Now it refers to states that don't require union membership to, hold a job. But it's interesting framing, right? It's a way to pit non-union workers against union workers, and so language was important. So this idea that a workplace should not have unions, employers and their allies refer to these as open shops. And that sounds fairly palatable, right? Open shop. I mean, what sounds better, a closed shop or an open shop, right?
Open shop. Yeah.
Open shop, exactly. When workers would go on strike and employers would bring in strike breakers, the workers protesting would call those strike breakers scabs, right?
Yeah.
Well, employers turned around and said, no, they're not scabs. They're free workers. Free workers. They're not some slave to the union, right? And then when you'd have protesting workers trying to keep out what they called scabs, what employers called free workers, the employers and their allies would say, give this person the right to work. And so you have language is very important in this movement. And so I refer to this as what I call the narrative creators. So you have what I call the terrorists, those who clamp down and crack the skulls of protesting workers. You have the enablers; these are the politicians who allow it to happen. And then you have the narrative creators who create language designed to legitimize all of this.
So you talk about scabs. When I was growing up, my grandfather would always tell me stories about how there was the black hand that was around,
Oh wow!
and individuals who would try to get a job at certain places that was heavily regulated by unions. If they went around the union, you would find them in a ditch, dead, with the black hand on their chest, right?
Wow!
These
Wow!
individuals would be. trying to go around it. But these unions had so much power, right? So I don't know if it was late 1800s, early 1900s, but this was a common thing. So unions, they really grew to this extreme powerful organization, and people feared them, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting. I've never heard that. That's very, very interesting. The Black Hand. I'm going to investigate that further. Thank you for the heads up.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, what workplaces are basically dictatorships. And what unions do is they create, in theory and in practice, they give workers a voice and they give workers a contract that outlines their benefits. And so, is it the case that unions can be corrupt? Absolutely, absolutely. Plenty of corrupt unions. But I think it boils down to, how do you make change? Do you make change individually, or do you make change collectively? And that's the fundamental issue, I think, behind unionism. And so the same people who proclaim their love of the open shop and the right to work got together with others. They had their own unions. These are businessmen unions, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Citizens Alliances, the Law and Order Leagues. And they also penalized elites for not wanting to join. They engaged in their own acts of thuggery, which I outline in my book.
So I interviewed somebody recently about how the elites really did fight back. And I guess it didn't take too long for them to say, hey, we need to get on the side. We need to have some type of popular or image in front of many people. So I don't know if they've started to buy off the media or started to become more favorable.
Right.
Right around 1900, I guess, in that area, I think you start to see how JP Morgan and all these other people start to get on the side of, I guess I don't know if it's the Democrats at that point, but it's more so farmers
Mm-hmm.
who want maybe printing of money. And so they're trying to maybe become more favorable for the viewpoints of many. So the elites do shift their tone. And maybe it's because of people like Henry Ford saying, all right, you guys want a working wage. I'm going to make it so you can see very clearly that you can make a living wage here and be safe by doing it so you can have your own life. So they eventually change their tone, become more favorable, and I would assume potentially buy off media to do so.
Without a doubt.
What's that?
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were hundreds of anti-union novels, right? We get our, in addition to newspapers and that kind of thing, right? Novels that, we know about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? And the meat packing, and we learn about that. But there were many, many others that were written from the vantage point of an elite. And one of my chapters in my book looks at the book The Virginian, which started the Western genre of fiction. And the author, Owen Wister, was a member of these vigilante organizations and worked for the PR committee. Another important figure who worked for anti-union, anti-labor groups was George Creel. And now George Creel worked for Woodrow Wilson during World War I. He did the propaganda, but he was kind of a liberal type, but he was also anti-union. So one of the things that I try to explore in this book, as well as my previous one, is that liberalism and anti-unionism were perfectly compatible. In other words, this idea that there should be individual rights for the workers, just like there should be child labor protections, was championed from the right all the way to the center left. And so these ideas were very powerful. And so in coal mining and steel mills in Pennsylvania and other places, you have these strong union ideas that circulate. But beyond those areas, you also have a lot of anti-union ideas that found expression in the press, in novels, in speeches, from the pulpit, that kind of thing.
So you say this recap of history goes up until 1917. I think it's what in the late 1890s, maybe early 1900s, the populist movement starts to really take
Right.
form. And I believe this is where, I mean, I think it's mostly farmers. Farmers made up, I think, 45% of the people back then. So populist movement starts to gain traction, which really does have ripples into the 1920s, 1930s. But I think that had something to do with this transformation, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the farmers movement, the People's Party, pretty powerful. We have the Omaha platform that they put forward in 1892 in Omaha on July 4th, and they single out Carnegie. They single out the great barons, and this was an
Robber
interesting
barons. They called them robber barons, right?
robber barons, precisely a term. There's some debate about it, but I've read it was a Kansas farmer who coined the phrase. But absolutely, so you have a movement that was really the populists were really about industrial bigness, right? They weren't necessarily anti-capitalist, though some were. They were anti-monopoly
Yeah.
in many ways. And so the anti-monopoly framework was adopted by business leaders, right? The populists and others complained about what they called big business. Employers and their allies complained about what they called big labor, right? They use that as sort of right, and the folks sort of in the middle, the proprietary capitalists, the farmer, these were maybe somebody that the populists kind of on the left and the employers kind of on the right could probably agree upon, somebody they wanted to champion.
Hmm. And so I'm looking at some of these names in your book here, right? Just in the outline in the beginning of the book. I don't know who DB McKay is. I don't know who Owen Wister is. West Goodwin, J. West Goodwin. These seem like they're prominent names, but yet I've never heard of them. So were they
Yeah,
just
yeah.
figures in either the vigilantism or are they on the side of, I don't know, you could really say good and evil? I don't know. Explain these people if you can.
Yeah. I appreciate the question, and I assume that most people probably don't know who they were. I'm looking at case studies, so I'm looking at powerful people in their communities. So I'm not looking at the J. Well, I do talk about Jay Gould and Rockefeller, but I'm looking at folks who were, maybe they had the Chamber of Commerce in their community, and they were really pissed off about labor unrest. So Owen Wister was the novelist I just mentioned. DB DB McKay was a newspaper owner in Tampa, Florida, and he was married into a very wealthy cigar manufacturing family. And in 1901, the cigar workers, many Cubans in Tampa, went on this massive strike. And DB McKay, as well as dozens of other elites, formed a citizens committee, and they kidnapped 13 of the union leaders. They put them on a boat and they sent them to Honduras. They left them in Honduras and they came back. This was 1901. Now, the press wrote about this and said, wow, this is a great solution to the labor problem. Kidnap people. And so then in Colorado, we see employers kidnapping workers, putting them on trains and moving them to Kansas and New Mexico and elsewhere. So kidnapping as a form of management became popular out of that DB McKay. Now, J. West Goodwin was from Sedalia, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City, east of it. And he was a leader of the Law and Order League. He kind of founded it, as one of the founders, and was a member of the Citizens Alliance. And he helped build employers associations around the country. He called himself the Christopher Columbus of the Citizens Alliance movement. And these activists, like those in Tampa, engaged in kidnapping, engaged in driving people out. And so, what I'm trying to do is say, when we think about the history of management, we might think of, efficiency and human resource departments. And I'm looking at thuggery. I'm looking at different forms of thuggery. But it worked. It worked. They resolved their labor problems by engaging in what I call terrorism.
Man, I've never heard that story with DB McKay, and kidnapping was somewhat like smiled upon. It sounds like so.
Well, there was a lawsuit. Or at least the victims and their allies appealed to the Justice Department, and the attorney went down. He met with both sides, and I didn't see any law breaking here. No
A
charges.
different time.
Yeah. So that's why I call them the enablers.
So something I've realized, and maybe because I'm more awake than ever, but you talk about how all of this, anger and frustration is going on up until World War I. And I mean, I see how it coincides with the creation of the Federal Reserve and how basically the world changes on completely there, and there's a war right afterwards, which does become the main focus and becomes a major distraction, which I think that's how wars are used to this day, right? So Um, what have you noticed in that time period? Do you think that that because of what they did with banks, the Federal Reserve, that did lead to World War One? Also, the moment World War One breaks out, it seems like that becomes headlines and all of this other stuff becomes forgotten about. So or just the temperature of the room goes down because there's something bigger to worry about. So have you noticed any type of, whether it's conspiracy or some type of connection between the elite saying we need to really fix this situation? Let's see if there's a war that we can help this country get into. Therefore, the pressure's off us. Anything you could say about that that's kind of scary to even reference?
My response is probably not terribly exciting. I had to find a date to end my book, and I thought World War One was, a good closing period because I could talk about this sort of vigilantism beyond that. I mean, we should remember that during World War One there were vigilantes that engaged that supported the government's work or fight effort, right? So the idea is if you're a working class person, you have two options. You're going to fight for the government, or you're going to work and build munitions, that kind of thing, right? And so
Yeah.
there were groups like the vigilante groups that sought to enforce that. And then after World War One, or actually just before it, but it really takes off after is the formation of the second Ku Klux Klan, which grew to some say as many as 5 million members
In the
by the
20s, it started, right?
in the 1920s. Well, it started in 1915, but it took off in 1920. And in 1919, there's a massive strike wave, 4 million workers in so many industries. And so I'm currently writing a book about the second Klan. And I argue, like the first Klan, it functioned like a vigilante employers association, right? It used racism and xenophobia to divide people, and then it engaged in active repressive work against insubordinate workers. It, like the first Klan, it didn't just go out and just kill and beat black people, although they were surely racist. They wanted black folks and other people to shut up and work, stay in your place.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So how did if we could kind of like, wrap it up in a bow, I guess that really never died, but did Law and Order start to really, were people starting to get angry at this vigilantism? Therefore, there was pressure on the politicians to maybe put more funding into Law and Order to put a stop to it, or were there federal funds put into Law and Order, therefore vigilantism was not as necessary? How did it start to dwindle out of our lexicon, if you will?
It's really interesting. Maybe the 1930s, when you see labor unions more legitimized with FDR. You have this legislation that gives them a seat at the table. At the same time, that helped to de-radicalize unions. But employers have never liked unions. Have understandably from their vantage point, right?
Right.
They run these workplaces. They want to call the shots. They don't want to negotiate. They want to rule sort of unilaterally. So do we see vigilantism continuing to this day? I would say we do. Not as not we don't see law and order leagues. The Klan is not as big as it used to be. Of course, it's still there. I think what I don't know if you're following the current Palestinian demonstrations, but we did see a vigilante attack of about 200 people in Los Angeles, and I heard that they were funded by some wealthy people. So it depends on the level of struggle, I suppose, right? I mean, we saw a little bit of it with the Black Lives Matter happening and whatnot, but I think the Citizens Alliances, the Klan, they were much bigger in their day, going through into the early 1930s.
Citizens Alliance. I mean, I see that referenced in your book quite a bit. I have never heard of that, and it
Yeah,
just blows my mind that I went through school or even did a lot of, research or watched a bunch of documentaries, and I'd never heard that phrase. And maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but that seems like it's significant. And you always hear Klansman, Ku Klux
right.
Klan, but you never hear this.
But isn't it interesting? I mean, there's think of the language, how unthreatening that sounds. Citizen, we're
Citizens
all
Alliance
citizens,
sounds
right?
great.
Yeah,
Sounds
sounds good.
amazing.
And so, and one of the interesting things that they did through language is a lot of employers in the late 19th and early 20th century referred to what they called the dangerous classes, and they wanted to fight the dangerous classes. Well, what does the Citizens Alliance do? They talk about protecting the rights of the common people. So they're there to help the non-union worker, the small business owner, against these union tyrants, as they described it. So language is important. Remember, right to work, open shop, citizens alliance, right? The narrative creators, I call them.
And I know you don't reference, I guess, me specifically the elites, certain players, but Rockefeller, if there's one guy that I think changed America more than anybody else, I really believe it's Rockefeller. And
Sure.
I watched a video recently, and it really made sense that obviously he did the pipeline. He was the oil magnate. He
Mhm.
changed oil production, and then when the government came in and said, you need to break this up because of the antitrust, maybe there was a shift in his mind that said, F you, I'm going to do whatever I want. Now I'll become almost evil to really hurt people and do so much that destroys maybe the medical world and then the education system. I mean, he got into everything and changed it. So, is there any one or two figures, I guess, that stand out in your book that really did that you highlighted, but also went on to either change, whether it's Law and Order or America as we know it? Anybody that really stands out?
Yeah, I think the labor relations, the nature of our society does um, owe much to sort of these smaller guys, right? Who were important in building employer unity, important in putting out ideas, anti-union ideas, and those ideas are still very much circulate. Right to work, open shop. These are depending on your politics, if you like that kind of thing, these are the unsung heroes of that. And
Right,
so
right to work. By the way, I was in a lawsuit battle. I sued a company years ago because there was something about a non-compete. Well, in Pennsylvania, it's a right to work state. Non-competes really didn't hold up at all in court. So I was like, that's a right to work state. That's where it comes from then, is what you're saying.
I don't know your particular case, but with respect to labor management relations, right to work, of course, is about protecting the interests of the non-union worker, and I think by extension, protecting the interest of the employer.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I gotta look into the history of that because I always thought, oh, because it was just really to be workers' rights, but you're saying it indirectly protected the employer. Interesting.
Yes, and again, it's language. It's about how you frame things, right? So I think that's a very savvy phrase, right to work.
Hmm. And employers, is there any employer that really did it the right way? Anybody who became sort of a protagonist in all this, or maybe some of the ones that really stand out as the dragons or the demons of this era?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound moralistic. I mean, I really think that both sides do what they do because it serves their interests, really. And so I think there's probably a crisis with some. They see repression happening. They might be uncomfortable with it. There are a number of employers who are very benevolent people. They give out, turkeys at Christmas, or they build a gymnasium for their workers. They some of this is cynically done to avoid unions. Some of it reflects their own sort of worldview and their desire to build sort of cross class harmony with their workers. So difficult to say, but at the end of the day, it's business, right?
So, you've done so much research, you understand the game way more than I do in the past. So, do you see anything that basically lives on and we're seeing even to this day that just the trend just grows or it morphs a little bit, but once again history rhymes to some degree? So are you noticing anything now or potentially in the future that really reminds you of this moment in time?
Yeah, I think union resistance, the resistance to organized labor, is very strong, and
Yes.
it's remained very strong. And again, it reflects the interests of those. I'm not, it's kind of, in Europe you have more acceptance, I suppose, but there's something about um, the history, the culture that we can really date back to, the Wild West and the vigilante tradition in some ways, right? It's uh, not about cracking skulls so much anymore, but there is this idea that this is my workplace, and I don't think it's necessary to sit down and negotiate with a third party, that kind of thing.
Hmm. And is there any one moment that stands out in this book? I mean, you talk about how there were certain situations of book burnings and shutting down meetings. Anything that was sort of like a fire starter? We talked to a guy recently. I think he was talking about Croxy's army. It's basically I think it was Croxy. Basically these little moments that become amplified because of some devastating moment or just how the media reports on it that does change things. So, anything that stands out in this book?
I might have to go back to that Tampa kidnapping, right? When they kidnapped these folks, they brought them to Honduras, and it inspired employers in other places to kidnap outside agitators, what they called outside agitators. They were often from the community, right? And so, yeah.
That is insane. I got to look into that because I have not heard about that. It's weird how so many interesting things from history are never talked about in school. And
Right.
I
By
guess that's a,
design.
by design. So
Right.
that's my, I guess one of my last questions for you. The more you understand history and the more it kind of blows your mind of like, wow, this really happened. Why didn't I learn about it sooner? I do blame the school system. In my opinion, we should know as much as possible. Therefore, the individuals who are kind of wiping all this away, it's not doing anybody any good except for the ones who want for it to be repeated. So,
Right.
what are your thoughts on what's happening in the school system? You're obviously a teacher. You might be a
Yeah.
little bit more leaning one way than the other because of that. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I really believe in academic freedom, and I think academic freedom is under attack. And I believe in academic freedom for people across the political spectrum. I tell my students, I said, look, I don't care if you're on the right, the left, whatever. You make an argument, just back it up, right? And I used to be kind of like, oh, but don't offend anybody. No, no, you're going to offend people sometimes. This is life, right? And so we should be honest about the past. We should not try to sugarcoat it. We shouldn't tell fairy tales. um, you know, uh, I don't want to offend some of your listeners, but Greg Abbott wants to prevent the teaching of some things. He's the governor of Texas. And I asked my students, I said, look, we're going to talk about slavery. Should I talk about it? Because Greg Abbott doesn't want me to talk about it. Should I do it? Should I do it? And they said, oh, do it. So I think we should, we should be honest about the past. And, having said that, teaching is in some ways, you're making decisions about what you cover, right? And so it is inherently political in some ways.
Man, I don't know what to make of Greg Abbott. Sometimes you hear great things, maybe it's a show, and then sometimes you hear things like that, and you're like, what the hell are they doing down there? It's just, it seems like special interest gets a hold of them every once in a while, but I don't know. I mean, I'm a freedom guy. I
Yeah,
still do not think that kids should be learning about sexual shit at 5 years old, 6 years old. So some things should not be taught to kids, but God almighty, when it comes to the history,
right.
how could you be handcuffed to not talk
Yeah,
about it, right?
that's right. That's right. And so, yeah, so that's, I it's a balancing act, and I understand. I want to be sensitive to folks irrespective of their political views, but there's some stuff that might make people uncomfortable, but that's life, right? I mean, you got to learn about things that make you uncomfortable.
Bingo. Guys, his
Yeah.
book is called Capitals Terrorists. And I really didn't know where you're going to go with this. I mean, when I talk to teachers, you just never know what they're going to say. And many people don't agree in the education system with what I say. So, it's great to talk with you. And it seems like we share many sentiments on that. So, your book is called Capitals Terrorists, Klansmen, Lawmen, and Employers in the Long 19th Century. You have multiple books, but is there a website or a social media channel that you are quite active on?
I do have an Instagram account. I crack a lot of jokes there, but I would direct you to my faculty webpage if you want to know more about my academic work.
Beautiful. In Texas, you say you teach where? Where is it at?
University of North Texas in Denton, Texas,
Got it. Okay.
north of Denver.
I didn't know if you were near the insanity that's happening in Austin, but I guess not, huh? Right.
Yeah, no, no here. So
Okay. So still in Texas. It's going to be a chaotic 2024 no matter where you're at. So I think it's important to know your history. That's why I respect anybody who's an historian. I love it. So guys, pick up his book. It's 5-star ratings on Amazon. And Chad Pearson, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Remember, guys, $1 million book will lead to $1 million life.